Climate change had been a worry of mine ever since I was roughly a teenager. So, obviously, Our Goals and Inconvenient Truth came out when I was in high school. And there were several other books as well, which had a pretty lasting impact on me. So, in university, I believe it was in 2009, when I went to the Copenhagen climate negotiations as part of a select student delegation. I also read Mark Linus's Six Degrees, which is essentially a pretty horrifying recount of the impacts of warming at every single degree Celsius temperature rise. And that too impacted me quite a lot. And I think it was those two experiences, both being exposed to just how bad environmental problems could be throughout high school and particularly in university, and also seeing firsthand how inadequate geopolitics was with actually handling these problems. That got me thinking about the very worst case scenarios and led me to kind of exploring this more both in climate change but also in a broader selection of problems, including things like nuclear war. Apart from that, and this is purely speculative, I wouldn't be surprised if a childhood of reading comic books always made me think about the bigger picture. Obviously in things like Marvel and DC, they're always going to the very biggest, grandest problems, saving not just the universe, but sometimes the multiverse. And hence, I always like the idea of trying to think big, of trying to think through what's actually these really great grand questions, which people often haven't addressed because they're afraid to go past their own disciplinary bounds, but the ones that really matter for humanity. Um, and yeah, I guess that's the reason I have shied away from big questions like, will society collapse? Is there a pattern to how societies collapse throughout the future, throughout the past? And what does that mean for our future? In many ways, the book began a long time ago, over a decade ago. In 2016, I was lecturing in climate change science and policy back at the Australian National University. And by the end of the course, the students were always dreadfully depressed for obvious reasons. We'd always have two lectures to try to lift them up. One was on the social solutions for climate change, so protest and mass mobilization. And the other was on technical solutions, in particular, something you may have heard of called geoengineering, essentially big interventions to change and engineer the climate. And it was in the process of researching that I started thinking about all the other things that could go wrong apart from climate change. And think about it, if we achieved the Herculean task of decarbonizing by 2050 and reached net zero emissions, and yet we had a nuclear war in 2051, we're still kind of doomed. And so I started thinking about this as a Pokemon problem. You have to catch them all. You have to not just solve climate change, but also nuclear weapons, also emerging technologies, etc. And I joined the Centre for the Study of Accidental Risk here at Cambridge in 2018. And what really made me think about this big historical picture was two things. One was whenever I spoke to my colleagues, they almost always had a picture of the past informing their visions of the future. So people often, for instance, would have this idea of human history is largely being driven by technology. And humans can't really control technology. And technology's been largely a good thing, a driver of innovation and progress. And we just need to keep it up but avoid the downsides. And that ultimately there's not too much we can do because technology is an unstoppable wave, as someone called it. And that's essentially a historical claim in many ways. It's claims and assumptions about human nature, what drives history, etc. And I wanted to make sure that if I had a view of the past and a view of human nature that was coloring my own way of studying these big risks, I wanted to interrogate it. I wanted to know what's the best evidence to actually base this on. And apart from that, the other was simply that many people were trying to think about the end of the world just purely by making speculative visions of future technologies, like AI, for instance. That's fine. That's one way of doing it. But I think the only real robust way I could do it was by thinking through empirically how have societies in the past dealt with crisis, how they've collapsed, how they've proven resilient, and how do we reach this current point in humanity's predicament? And from trying to do some of what are called foresight and forecasting studies, basically making predictions about the future, both very kind of concrete numerical ones, but also just painting big plausible pictures, I realized that most of the methods aren't very good. And the only way I really felt comfortable thinking deep into the future was by looking deep into the past. I think you can only really get an idea of what humanity's trajectory is by understanding how we got here in the first place. And that all led me to basically 300,000 years ago and doing an enormous amount of work with anthropologists, historians, and archaeologists as well, who I might add are just the best people to work with. I've had to collaborate with a lot of different disciplines, but the historical sciences are still my favorite people. And 7 years later, the book is finally here. This is what Peter Turchin and Dan Hoyer work on. It's basically called structural demographic theory. So you have this combination of people getting poorer and an increasing number of elites who are battling it out. It's what I call elite factionalism, because elites don't just compete, they also cooperate together. On top of that, we also know that when you get more inequality, you tend to get more corruption. And that basically funnels money and resources away from the state and towards private elites. On top of that, as you get more and more elites battling it out more to more resources, that tends to drive both expansion, a desire for more conquest to, of course, get more resources, compete for status, and additionally, environmental degradation. You basically need to start to work the land and things like mines much more intensely. And on top of all that, one thing people don't talk about enough is how societies respond. So Jared Diamond in his book Collapse, he has this kind of five-figure model. And one of the variables here he talks about is why societies don't respond well to oncoming crises. And he doesn't really have a clear answer for that. In this case, I think there is one. It's oligarchy. As you get increasing concentrations of power, as a society becomes more extractive, essentially you start to get oligarchies where there's a smaller number of people making decisions and they tend to have an interest in maintaining the status quo. What does that mean? It means usually worse decision making, particularly worse decision making in the face of ongoing crisis. And well, there's historical case studies we can look at. I think some of the most interesting ones actually is in the modern world. When you look at something like climate change, for instance, or even the threat of nuclear weapons, it's pretty clear that those who are benefiting from their creation are also the same ones who are basically preventing us from making good decisions on it. So, in short, you have increasing concentrations of power, you have an increasingly extractive society where elites are taking more from the general population, and that for several reasons, including things like imperial overexpansion, corruption, elite infighting, inequality itself, and oligarchy, make the society more fragile until eventually it's broken apart by some kind of oncoming disaster, such as climate change, a drought, warfare, or a disease. And in some cases, like with the Western Roman Empire or the Han Dynasty, you actually see all of these kind of coming together.